Do you know what kind of a sound that was? That was a horse. And not just an ordinary horse either. A very special horse. He was a Kentucky colonel, and I think you might enjoy hearing his story. You would? That's fine. Just sit back there and make yourself comfortable. Colonel Kershaw B. Horse was a racing horse who didn't like to run fast. He always said that he was the historian of his family. He never moved faster than a slow, gentle trot, and that only for 5 minutes before dinner time. But he was not against other horses racing. Oh, no, just the opposite. He was fired with pride when he thought of the glorious history of his family and the great races they had won. In fact, he spent most of his time thinking about it. He'd just lean up against a tree in the pasture, chew that delicious Kentucky bluegrass, and think about it. One day, while the colonel was resting out in the shadiest part of the pasture, chewing on bluegrass and thinking about the glorious racing tradition of his family, a big bus broke down on the road that ran next to the pasture. The bus was quite empty. The driver was sitting sadly on a rock as though he didn't know what to do next. The colonel strolled over, careful to stay in the shade, and said,
"Bus break down?"
The little man nodded.
"Too bad."
"It always breaks down. I guess I'm not a very good driver."
The colonel leaned up against the tree to save his strength.
"Maybe you all ought to get into a different business."
The little man came to life when the colonel said that. He answered,
"I wish I could. All my life I've wanted to be a real jockey who rode racing horses in races. Why, I'd be the best jockey in the world if it weren't for one thing."
"What's that one thing?"
"I can't ride horses."
The colonel looked down at him in amazement.
"Do you mean you let a little thing like that stand in your way, sir?"
The little man was very grateful.
"That's what I've always thought. Why should I have to know how to ride? I look absolutely wonderful in those silk jockey suits. I never gain an ounce of weight, and I certainly love racing horses. Gosh, racing horses are the most beautiful animals in the world."
The colonel smiled. He was very pleased.
"You're a right fine little man. Why, the best jockeys in the world can't ride at all. My granddaddy, his name was Manowar, told me once that the best jockeys are the ones who keep you the best company when you're all alone away out in front. Give a good horse a pleasant, entertainin' jockey, my granddaddy would say, and a good horse just has to get away from the clatterin' noises all the other horses make in a race, just to be able to hear the stories a real good jockey can tell. Isn't a matter of riding at all."
"Is that true?"
"Why, of course it's true," answered the colonel.
"Why, I know hundreds of stories that any racing horse would love to hear."
"You do? Well, tell me some."
"But I really don't know how to stay up on a horse. I just fall off in the middle of a race and embarrass everybody."
"Little man, that's just enough of that. Don't you ever believe the jockeys ride racing horses. The racing horse's first job is to learn how to balance a jockey just right to make him comfortable, so's he can sit up there without a worry in the world, so's he can settle back and entertain the racing horse with his fine old stories. Didn't you ever see a good jockey? He just stretches himself out along the horse's neck with his nice soft voice right in the horse's ear and keeps the horse company right to the finish. Now you just jump up here on my back. We don't need a saddle. If you know some fine old stories, I want to hear 'em."
So the little man climbed very cautiously up on the colonel's back and started to tell him a fine old story. The colonel ran right across the pasture and out onto the practice racetrack, which was on the horse farm, and he whizzed right past every horse in sight as he balanced the little man very carefully on his back. All the horse trainers just stood and stared and looked at their watches, which show how fast horses can run. They couldn't have been more surprised. Colonel Kershaw B. Horse, the laziest horse in the world, was breaking every speed record the racing world had ever known. What a day! The colonel started running at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At 10 o'clock that night, when the moon looked like a silver button high in the sky, the little man said in a very hoarse voice,
"End of part 1, continued next ride."
"Oh, all right," said the colonel, "if that's the way you feel."
Then they walked slowly over to the stables, where all the trainers and grooms and stable hands were waiting, standing in a big half circle behind the big important owner of all the horses and the horse farm.
"Evening,"
said the colonel.
"Mighty fine evening, ain't it?"
The owner just stared at the colonel in admiration. Looking up at the great horse, the owner knew he owned the champion of champions.
"Evening, Colonel Kershaw,"
he gulped. "I hope you enjoyed your run."
"Enjoy it?"
the colonel answered.
"Why, I never had such a high old time in my life."
Everyone waited for the big owner to pop the great question. The owner was waiting for exactly the right time. When the colonel had settled down comfortably in his favorite chair in the corner of the stall, the owner cleared his throat and popped the great question.
"We are sure glad and happy that you enjoyed that little old 7-hour run you had today. We are also very pleased that you broke every single speed record in the whole wide world. We do hope you'll keep it up." "Well, that's very nice of you," said the colonel.
"And now," said the owner,
"if you'll just sign right here on this little old dotted line, we are going to see that you race tomorrow in the world-famous Kentucky Derby."
The colonel did his very best to be polite.
"It's a known fact on your great horse farm, sir, that I don't take to racing. I'm the historian of my family. Do excuse me, sir, and good night to you all."
The colonel gently closed the door of his stall and started in brushing his teeth before going to bed. Outside, the big owner, the trainers, the grooms, and the stable hands were very sad. They could only think that the colonel was the fastest racing horse in the world, and what a shame it was that he wouldn't race in the Kentucky Derby. The little man walked across the stable yard toward the main gate. Suddenly he turned around.
"I'm just the right size. I look just fine in a jockey suit, and I never gain an ounce of weight."
But the owner didn't hear him. The owner walked slowly and sadly in the other direction, heartbroken because the colonel wouldn't run and win him that great big silver punch bowl. Then the colonel stuck his head out.
"Little man! Little man!"
"Yes, Colonel?"
the little man replied, and the owner stopped walking to turn around.
"You're a wonderful old jockey, little man. Real fine company for a good horse. You'll be right here at 9:15 tomorrow morning, you hear? You and me is going for another all-day ride on the practice track. I must hear the end of that story. Yes, sir. If I was a racing horse, instead of the historian of the family, you'd be the only old jockey for me."
Then the colonel closed his door and went to bed for the night. The owner ran clear across the stable yard and shook the little man's hand. He shook it and shook it.
"Well, sir, I sure am glad to meet you. 'Deed I am. Pardon me, sir, but did I hear you say you wanted a job as a jockey?"
"Yes, sir."
"What have you ridden before? That is, before you rode the colonel this afternoon."
"A bus."
"That's just fine. Now you come along with me. I'd like to tell you what we are going to do."
And the little man and the big owner walked off toward the house, arm in arm like two of the oldest friends in the world. At 9:30 the next morning, the colonel was waiting outside the stable, tapping his foot impatiently and wearing a brand-new English racing saddle on his broad back. At last the little man arrived. He was wearing a brand-new silk jockey suit in colors of purple, green, and yellow. He had on soft, high, shiny jockey boots. He was wearing a long silk peak cap that made him look just wonderful.
"Morning, Colonel."
Come on. You're very late. Jump up here now on my back and get started on the last part of that fine old story. Come on, let's get moving."
"I'm not gonna do it."
"You're not gonna what it? Why, I've been tossing around in that stall all night, dreaming about nothing else but the ending to that story."
"I'm very sorry, Colonel, but I just have to be a jockey, and running around the practice track isn't going to get me anywhere at all."
"But I have to hear the end of that story,"
said the colonel.
"I'll tell you the story if you'll run in the Kentucky Derby today."
And that's how the colonel happened to walk into that horse truck and ride to Louisville to race in the Kentucky Derby. What a day it was! The crowds were milling, the bands were playing. The greatest and fastest horses in the whole wide world were there, hoping to become famous by winning the Kentucky Derby. The little man was so excited he could hardly talk. He kept looking from the thousands of cheering people to the jumpy, nervous horses, afraid he was going to fall off the colonel halfway around the track and ruin everything. The colonel was leaning against the starting gate, chewing on bluegrass, and waiting for more of the story.
"Come on, little man. What happened next? How did the beautiful princess escape from the Wicked Witch's castle?"
The bell rang. The starting gate opened, the horses plunged forward.
"They're off!" the crowd
crowd shouted, and the finest racing horses in all the world shot like arrows along the rail of the track, each one straining to race out in front. The little man gasped, Colonel, get moving. Colonel, stop standing here. The other horses left long ago.
I asked you a simple question, sir,
the colonel said coolly.
I asked you just as nice as I could. How did that beautiful princess get herself out of that wicked witch's castle?
All at once, the little man started to tell the story, and the colonel shot out of the starting gate like a cannonball. The little man went on with the story, making it more and more exciting, and in no time they caught up with all the other horses. The clatter of hooves, the puffing and snorting, and the shouting of the other jockeys made a terrible noise. The colonel could hardly hear the little man's story, so he just naturally ran faster. Zzz! He raced away out in front of them, so far ahead that before he got to the finish line, as the little man was coming to the end of his story, he slowed down to a dignified, delicate trot, just so he wouldn't miss a word. The colonel won the Kentucky Derby. The judges piled flowers on the colonel and stood him beside the big owner and gave them both a great big silver punch bowl and about $100,000. The big owner talked over the radio, and they took the colonel's picture 50 times. The colonel was shaking his head all through this, still enthralled with the story of the beautiful princess. He turned around and looked up at the little man sitting high on his back.
Little man, you sure can tell a pretty fine old story. Surely you know another one.
Why, I certainly do. I know hundreds and hundreds of stories, even better than the one I just told you.
Well, what's holding you? Hurry on and start telling.
Well, said the little man, once upon a time when the world was filled with magicians, wizards, and beautiful princesses. And they shuffled off happily toward the stables, while the little man murmured another fine old story into the colonel's ear. Now, wasn't that the story of a very special horse?